before the pyramids pierced the sky, before the pharaohs claimed dominion over the Nile, before Egypt became the name that echoed through eternity, there was another kingdom. A civilization so ancient that even the earliest Egyptian dynasties looked upon its ruins with wonder. A land where black-skinned warriors ruled, where gold flowed like water, and where the first seeds of African greatness were planted in soil that would nurture empires for millennia to come. This is the story of Ta-Seti, the land of the bow, the forgotten first kingdom that stood at the dawn of human civilization. The world knows Egypt, the temples of Karnak, the enigma of the Sphinx, the golden death mask of Tutankhamun. These images have been burned into the collective consciousness of humanity, celebrated in textbooks, displayed in museums, immortalized in films. But what came before? What civilization laid the foundations upon which Egypt would build its legendary empire? The answer lies in the shadows of history, deliberately obscured, conveniently erased, systematically ignored. It lies in Nubia, in the land that stretches south from Aswan, where the Nile cuts through golden deserts and black granite hills. It lies in Ta-Seti. If you hunger for the true history they never taught you, if you seek the stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about Africa and civilization itself, then join us on this journey into the depths of forgotten time. Subscribe now, because this is only the beginning of what we're going to uncover together. The name Ta-Seti translates to Land of the Bow, a title that speaks to the fearsome reputation of Nubian archers whose skills were unmatched in the ancient world. But this was no mere collection of tribal warriors. This was a structured kingdom, a centralized state, a civilization with cities, trade networks, religious institutions, and political hierarchies. Archaeological evidence places Ta-Seti's emergence around 3,800 to 3,500 BCE during the Naqada period, predating the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by at least 3 centuries. While the peoples of the Nile Valley were still forming loose chiefdoms and village communities, Ta-Seti had already established itself as a cohesive political entity. The kingdom stretched along the Nile from the first cataract at Aswan southward into what is now Sudan, encompassing the region known as Lower Nubia. This was a land of dramatic contrasts. The river brought life, its annual floods depositing rich silt that fed crops of barley, wheat, and sorghum. But beyond the narrow green ribbon of cultivation, the desert dominated, a vast expanse of sand and rock that simultaneously isolated and protected the kingdom. The cataracts, those turbulent stretches of rapids and rock formations that interrupted the Nile's flow, served as natural fortifications, making invasion difficult and trade controllable. But Ta-Seti's true wealth lay beneath the ground. Gold, copper, amethyst, carnelian, diorite. The earth itself seemed to bleed riches in this land. The gold mines of Nubia would later become legendary, fueling the treasuries of Egyptian pharaohs for thousands of years. But first, they enriched Ta-Seti. The kingdom's goldsmiths developed sophisticated techniques for working the precious metal, creating jewelry, ceremonial objects, and symbols of royal power that dazzled the eye and proclaimed the authority of their rulers. Copper, essential for tools and weapons, gave Ta-Seti a technological edge over neighboring peoples still dependent on stone implements. The semi-precious stones were carved into beads, amulets, and decorative items that became prized trade goods throughout the Nile Valley and beyond. Trade was the lifeblood of Ta-Seti. The kingdom sat at a crucial crossroads, controlling access to the wealth of Inner Africa. Ivory from elephant herds that still roamed freely across the continent. Ebony wood, prized for its density and deep black color. Leopard skins and ostrich feathers, symbols of prestige and power. Incense from distant lands to the east. All of these goods flowed through Ta-Seti, enriching its merchants and filling its royal treasuries. The kingdom's traders ventured north into Egypt, establishing commercial relationships with the emerging chiefdoms of the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt. They traveled east to the Red Sea coast, connecting with maritime trade networks that reached to the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. They journeyed south and west into the African interior, bringing back goods that seemed almost magical to the peoples of the Mediterranean world. The cities of Ta-Seti rose from the desert like monuments to human ambition. Qustul, near the modern border between Egypt and Sudan, served as a major center of power. Here, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of sophisticated architecture, including what appears to be a royal palace complex. The structures were built from mud brick and stone, with thick walls that provided protection from both enemies and the brutal desert heat. Inside these walls, the elite of Ta-Seti lived lives of considerable comfort and luxury. Pottery found at the site shows remarkable craftsmanship, with intricate designs that demonstrate both artistic sophistication and cultural continuity. Stone vessels, carved from the region's abundant diorite and other hard stones, required immense skill to produce and served as status symbols for the wealthy and powerful. But perhaps the most significant discoveries at Qustul are the royal tombs. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, before the rising waters of Lake Nasser submerged much of Lower Nubia forever, archaeologists conducted emergency excavations in the region. What they found in Cemetery L at Qustul rewrote the history books, or at least it should have. The tombs contained artifacts that demonstrated the existence of a complex royal culture in Nubia before the first dynasty of Egypt. Incense burners decorated with royal iconography, stone vessels bearing symbols of kingship. Most dramatically, a stone incense burner depicts a seated figure wearing what appears to be the white crown of Upper Egypt, accompanied by symbols of royal authority, including the Horus falcon and a palace facade. This discovery was revolutionary and deeply controversial. For decades, Western Egyptologists had operated under the assumption that civilization flowed from Egypt outward, that the Nile Valley's cultural achievements originated in the north and spread southward into Nubia. The Ta-Seti artifacts suggested something very different. They indicated that symbols of kingship, royal iconography, and centralized political authority may have developed first in Nubia and then spread northward into Egypt. The implications were staggering. If true, it meant that the roots of Pharaonic civilization lay not in Egypt proper, but in Black Africa, among the Nubian peoples who would later be conquered, colonized, and written out of history by their northern neighbors. The academic establishment struggled with these findings. Some scholars embraced them, recognizing their profound implications for understanding African history and the development of civilization. Others rejected them, questioning the dating, disputing the interpretation of the artifacts, suggesting that the royal symbolism might have been imported from Egypt rather than originating in Ta-Seti. The debate grew heated, often taking on racial overtones that revealed uncomfortable truths about the biases embedded in archaeological and historical scholarship. How could Black Africans have created a civilization before Egypt? How could the primitive peoples of Nubia have developed complex political systems, sophisticated art, and international trade networks without Egyptian influence? But the evidence speaks for itself. Ta-Seti was real. Its cities stood, its kings ruled, its warriors fought, its merchants traded, its artisans created. Centuries before the first pharaoh united Egypt, Ta-Seti had already established the template for Nile Valley civilization: centralized kingship, divine monarchy, royal symbolism, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, and military organization. The kingdom may have been forgotten, buried under sand and submerged beneath lake waters, but it cannot be erased. The people of Ta-Seti were not isolated primitives living in cultural poverty. They were part of a vibrant world, connected through trade and cultural exchange to peoples across northeastern Africa and beyond. Their pottery styles show influences from multiple regions, demonstrating active participation in networks of cultural diffusion. Their weapons and tools incorporated materials and techniques from various sources. Their religious beliefs, while distinct, shared elements with neighboring cultures. This was a cosmopolitan kingdom, one that absorbed influences while maintaining its own unique identity. The social structure of Ta-Seti reflected its status as a complex state. At the apex stood the king, a figure who combined political authority with religious significance. The rulers of Ta-Seti were not merely military leaders or administrative officials. They were divine intermediaries, links between the human and spiritual realms, responsible for maintaining cosmic order and ensuring the prosperity of their people. The royal regalia, symbols of office that included crowns, scepters, and ceremonial weapons, marked them as beings set apart from ordinary mortals. Their tombs, filled with precious goods and luxury items, were designed to ensure their continued existence and power in the afterlife. Below the king stood a hierarchy of nobles, officials, and priests. These were the administrators who managed the kingdom's territories, collected taxes, organized labor for public works projects, and conducted the religious ceremonies that maintained harmony between the physical and spiritual worlds. Evidence suggests a literate or proto-literate administrative class, capable of record-keeping and communication across distances. While no extensive written texts from Ta-Seti have survived, the presence of symbols and marks on pottery and other artifacts hints at systems of notation that may have served administrative or ritual purposes. The military formed another crucial pillar of Ta-Seti society. The kingdom's warriors were renowned throughout the region for their skill, particularly in archery. The powerful composite bows of Nubia could strike at greater distances and with more force than the simpler bows used by other peoples. Ta-Seti's archers became legendary, feared by enemies and sought after as mercenaries by allies. The military wasn't merely a defensive force. It protected trade routes, enforced the king's authority over subject territories, conducted raids into neighboring regions for captives and plunder, and projected Ta-Seti's power northward into what would become Egypt. The common people, the farmers and herders and laborers who formed the majority of the population, lived lives of hardship tempered by the rhythms of the Nile. They worked the fields during the growing season, harvesting the grain that fed the kingdom. They tended flocks of cattle, sheep, and goats that provided meat, milk, and hides. They labored on construction projects, building the temples and palaces and tombs that proclaimed the power of their rulers. They paid their taxes in grain and labor, supporting the administrative and military apparatus that governed their lives. Yet they were not slaves or serfs. They were members of a community, part of a civilization that provided order, protection, and meaning in an uncertain world. Women in Ta-Seti held positions of respect and authority that would have been remarkable in many ancient societies. Evidence from burials and artistic representations suggests that women could own property, engage in trade, and hold religious offices. Some scholars have identified possible female rulers or regents in the archaeological record, though the evidence remains debated. What is clear is that Ta-Seti was not a society where women were systematically excluded from public life or relegated to purely domestic roles. The goddesses of the Nubian pantheon held powerful positions in the religious imagination, and earthly women seem to have reflected some of that divine authority. Religion permeated every aspect of life in Ta-Seti. The people worshipped a complex pantheon of deities who controlled the forces of nature, governed human destiny, and maintained cosmic order. The Nile itself was divine, a life-giving god whose annual floods were both a blessing and mystery. The sun, traveling across the sky by day and through the underworld by night, represented cycles of death and rebirth that shaped religious thought and practice. Animal deities, particularly lions, crocodiles, and falcons, embodied the fierce and unpredictable powers of the natural world. The dead were not gone, but transformed, existing in another realm where they required sustenance and remembrance from the living. Temples served as the houses of the gods, physical spaces where the divine and human worlds intersected. Priests conducted daily rituals, making offerings of food, drink, and incense to sustain the deities and ensure their favor. These were not optional ceremonies, but essential acts that maintained the balance of the universe. Without the proper rituals, chaos would intrude, crops would fail, enemies would triumph, and cosmic order would collapse into primordial disorder. The religious calendar was filled with festivals and celebrations, occasions when the entire community participated in honoring the gods, reinforcing social bonds, and reaffirming their collective identity. But Ta-Seti's golden age could not last forever. To the north, change was coming. The scattered chiefdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt were consolidating, unifying under ambitious rulers who would create one of history's greatest empires. These emerging Egyptian states looked south with hungry eyes. They saw Nubia's gold, its copper, its access to the wealth of Inner Africa. They saw a civilization they could conquer, exploit, and ultimately erase from memory. The relationship between Ta-Seti and pre-dynastic Egypt had long been complex, mixing trade, cultural exchange, competition, and occasional conflict. But as Egypt grew stronger, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The exact sequence of events that led to Ta-Seti's decline remains murky, obscured by the passage of millennia and the deliberate obfuscation of later Egyptian records. What is clear is that by the time of Egypt's first dynasty, around 3100 BCE, Ta-Seti's independence was ending. Egyptian kings launched military campaigns into Nubia, subjugating the region and bringing it under Pharaonic control. The cities of Ta-Seti fell one by one. Their kings were killed or forced to submit. Their treasuries were plundered. Their people were enslaved or reduced to subject status. The once proud kingdom became a source of raw materials and captive labor for the Egyptian empire. But this was not a simple story of civilized Egypt conquering primitive Nubia. It was the conquest of one civilization by another, the suppression of a kingdom that had flourished for centuries, the erasure of a people's achievements and history. The Egyptians recognized Ta-Seti's importance even as they destroyed it. Pharaonic records refer to Nubia as Ta-Seti, acknowledging the name the land bore before Egyptian conquest. Early Egyptian kings boasted of their victories over Nubia, testifying to the region's resistance and the difficulty of subjugation. The continuing rebellions throughout Egyptian history demonstrated that the people of Nubia never fully accepted foreign rule, never forgot that they had once been free, never stopped yearning for the restoration of their independence and dignity. Egypt did not merely conquer Ta-Seti. It absorbed its wealth, appropriated its symbols, and built upon its foundations. The gold that adorned pharaohs' crowns and filled their tombs came from Nubian mines. The military strategies that made Egyptian armies feared throughout the Near East borrowed heavily from Nubian warfare, particularly the devastating effectiveness of Nubian archers who served as elite troops in pharaonic forces. The symbols of kingship that became synonymous with pharaonic authority, the crowns and scepters and divine imagery, may well have originated in Ta-Seti before being adopted and adapted by Egyptian rulers. Even the famous pyramids, those ultimate symbols of Egyptian civilization, might owe something to Nubian architectural traditions and the region's mastery of stoneworking techniques. But Egypt wrote the history, and in that history, Ta-Seti disappeared. The pharaohs portrayed Nubians as enemies to be conquered, barbarians to be civilized, resources to be exploited. Egyptian art depicted Nubian captives in positions of submission, bound and humiliated, transformed into symbols of pharaonic power rather than recognized as inheritors of a noble civilization. The sophisticated culture that had flourished in the land of the bow for centuries was reduced to a footnote, mentioned only in contexts of warfare and subjugation. The kingdom that may have given Egypt the very template for its greatness was forgotten, buried under accumulated centuries of imperial propaganda and historical revisionism. This erasure was not accidental. It served the purposes of Egyptian rulers to portray themselves as the sole source of civilization in the Nile Valley, the original light that brought order to chaos and culture to barbarism. It served the purposes of later classical writers, Greeks and Romans who encountered Egypt and marveled at its antiquity, to perpetuate the myth of Egyptian primacy. And it served the purposes of European colonizers and scholars who wanted to believe that true civilization had never originated in Black Africa, that the achievements of Egypt must have been due to Mediterranean or Middle Eastern influences rather than indigenous African innovation. For thousands of years after Ta-Seti's fall, Nubia would remain under foreign domination, first Egyptian, then under various conquerors who swept through the region. But the people of Nubia did not vanish. They endured, maintaining their distinct identity, preserving memories of past glory, and occasionally reasserting their independence. The kingdom of Kush arose centuries after Ta-Seti's destruction, creating a civilization that would eventually conquer Egypt itself, establishing the 25th dynasty of black pharaohs who ruled the entire Nile Valley. This was not coincidence but continuity, the resurgence of a people who had never forgotten their heritage as kingdom builders and civilization creators. The Kushite conquest of Egypt stands as one of history's great ironies. The descendants of the people who had been subjugated by pharaohs became pharaohs themselves, ruling from Thebes and Memphis, building pyramids in Nubia, and presenting themselves as the true restorers of Egyptian civilization. The black pharaohs of the 25th dynasty saw themselves as liberators, bringing traditional Egyptian values and religious orthodoxy back to a land that had fallen into chaos and foreign domination. They were simultaneously Egyptian and Nubian, synthesizing the cultures and claiming inheritance of both civilizations. Their reign, though relatively brief, demonstrated that the spirit of Ta-Seti had never truly died, that the capacity for greatness remained latent in the Nubian people, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Even after the Kushite pharaohs fell to Assyrian invasion, Nubian civilization continued. The kingdom of Meroe flourished for nearly 1,000 years, developing its own writing system, building hundreds of pyramids, maintaining trade networks that stretched from the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa, and preserving a distinct cultural identity that combined indigenous African traditions with influences from Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The resilience of Nubian civilization across millennia testifies to the deep roots planted by Ta-Seti in that ancient time before the pharaohs. Modern archaeology has slowly, reluctantly begun to acknowledge what the evidence has long demonstrated, that African civilization did not begin with Egyptian colonization spreading southward, but with indigenous development across the continent, including in Nubia, where Ta-Seti established patterns that would shape the entire Nile Valley. The underwater archaeology conducted before Lake Nasser's waters rose, the excavations at sites like Kustul and Kerma, the careful analysis of pottery styles and royal iconography, all point to the same conclusion. Ta-Seti was real. Ta-Seti was first. Ta-Seti matters, yet the kingdom remains largely unknown outside specialist academic circles. Ask the average person about ancient Africa, and they will mention Egypt, perhaps vaguely aware of Ethiopia or other regions. Ask about the first civilization in the Nile Valley, and they will confidently assert Egypt without hesitation. The erasure that began with Egyptian conquest and continued through millennia of historical neglect has been devastatingly effective. Ta-Seti has been stolen from collective memory, written out of the human story, denied its rightful place in the narrative of civilization's origins. This is not merely an academic concern or a matter of setting the historical record straight, though both of those things are important. The erasure of Ta-Seti represents a broader pattern of denying African achievements, of attributing every accomplishment on the continent to outside influences, of refusing to acknowledge that black African peoples were full participants in the development of human civilization from its earliest moments. When we forget Ta-Seti, we perpetuate a lie that has justified centuries of exploitation, colonization, and cultural destruction. We deny African descendants everywhere the knowledge of their ancestors' greatness. We impoverish human history by excising one of its crucial chapters. The story of Ta-Seti is a story of beginnings, of the first stirrings of complex civilization in the Nile Valley, of kingdoms rising from the African earth, but it is also a story of endings, of conquest and erasure, of civilizations destroyed and histories rewritten by the victors. Most importantly, it is a story of resilience, of a people and a culture that refused to disappear despite overwhelming odds, that reasserted itself across millennia, that maintained its identity through centuries of foreign rule and cultural pressure. The spirit of Ta-Seti lived on in Kush, in Meroe, in the Nubian kingdoms that endured into the medieval period, and in the contemporary peoples of Sudan and southern Egypt, who are the descendants of those ancient kingdom builders. The physical evidence of Ta-Seti is fragmentary, scattered across museum collections and buried beneath the waters of Lake Nasser. Much was lost before archaeologists could properly document it, destroyed by the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960 seconds. What little was recovered faced skepticism and resistance from scholars invested in traditional narratives of Egyptian primacy. Yet what remains is sufficient to establish the kingdom's reality and significance. The tombs at Kustul speak of royal power and centralized authority. The trade goods found throughout the region testify to far-reaching commercial networks. The pottery, stone vessels, and metal objects demonstrate sophisticated craftsmanship. The military equipment proves organizational capacity and technological advancement. Ta-Seti was not a fantasy or a romantic invention of Afrocentric scholars, but a historical reality supported by archaeological evidence. Understanding Ta-Seti requires us to rethink fundamental assumptions about African history. We must abandon the notion that civilization was somehow alien to Africa, imported from outside and imposed upon passive recipients. We must recognize that the peoples of the continent were innovators and creators, developing complex societies, sophisticated technologies, and rich cultures independently and in interaction with neighboring regions. We must acknowledge that the story of human civilization is incomplete without Africa, that some of our species' greatest achievements occurred on African soil, among African peoples who deserve full credit for their accomplishments. The kingdom of Ta-Seti stands at the beginning of this revised understanding. Here, in the land of the bow, Africans created one of the world's first kingdoms, developed symbols of royal authority that would spread throughout the Nile Valley, established trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world to inner Africa, and built a civilization that flourished for centuries before being conquered but never truly destroyed. This was not primitive tribalism or simple chiefdom, but complex statehood, complete with centralized authority, social stratification, specialized labor, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade. This was civilization in the fullest sense of the word, arising in Africa among Africans before the pyramids and pharaohs that would later come to define the ancient world. The legacy of Ta-Seti extends beyond its direct historical influence on Egypt and later Nubian kingdoms. It represents a counter-narrative to the racist assumptions that have plagued African historiography for centuries. It demonstrates that African peoples were creating complex civilizations at the same time as, or even before, peoples in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and other regions celebrated as cradles of civilization. It proves that the capacity for political organization, cultural achievement, and technological innovation has never been the exclusive property of any one race or region, but is part of our shared human heritage. When we restore Ta-Seti to its rightful place in history, we do more than correct an academic oversight. We reclaim a stolen legacy. We assert the dignity and achievements of African peoples who have been systematically denied credit for their contributions to human civilization. We provide contemporary Africans and people of African descent everywhere with ancestors they can take pride in, kingdom builders and civilization creators who stood at the dawn of history. We enrich the human story by including chapters that have been deliberately excluded, voices that have been systematically silenced. The archaeological work that brought Ta-Seti back to light was itself dramatic and urgent. In the 1960 seconds, with the construction of the Aswan High Dam imminent, UNESCO launched an international campaign to save the monuments of Nubia. The world rallied to rescue the great temples of Abu Simbel and Philae, physically relocating them to higher ground before the rising waters of Lake Nasser could submerge them forever. It was one of archaeology's greatest triumphs, a testament to global cooperation in preserving human heritage. But while famous monuments were being saved, less spectacular but equally important sites were being lost. Teams of archaeologists raced against time, conducting emergency excavations in Lower Nubia before the floods came. They worked under brutal conditions, fighting desert heat, limited resources, and the constant knowledge that time was running out. Every day the dam grew higher. Every day the waters rose a little more. Every day, irreplaceable evidence of human history disappeared beneath the rising lake. The archaeologists worked frantically, excavating as many sites as possible, documenting what they found, removing artifacts before they were lost forever. But there was simply too much ground to cover and too little time. Thousands of sites, spanning millennia of human occupation, vanished beneath the waters, unexcavated and undocumented. Among the sites that were investigated before the flood was Cemetery L at Kustul. The tombs there dated to the terminal pre-dynastic period, that crucial moment in Nile Valley history when chiefdoms were consolidating into kingdoms and the foundations of Pharaonic civilization were being laid. What the archaeologists found challenged everything they thought they knew about this period. The royal iconography, the symbols of kingship, the evidence of centralized political authority, all appeared in Nubia before they appeared in Egypt. The implications were revolutionary and deeply uncomfortable for a discipline that had long assumed Egyptian primacy in all things. The lead archaeologist on the Kustul excavations, Bruce Williams, published his findings in the early 1982s, arguing that Ta-Seti represented a kingdom that predated the unification of Egypt and may have been the source of royal symbolism later adopted by Egyptian pharaohs. His work sparked intense debate. Supporters hailed it as a long-overdue recognition of Nubia's role in developing Nile Valley civilization. Critics attacked his methodology, his dating, his interpretation of the artifacts. Some suggested that the royal symbolism must have been imported from Egypt rather than originated in Nubia. Others argued that the sample was too small to support such sweeping conclusions. The controversy continues to this day, though accumulating evidence increasingly supports Williams's original thesis. What makes this debate particularly significant is its subtext. The resistance to acknowledging Ta-Seti's primacy is not merely academic conservatism or scholarly caution. It reflects deeper biases about race, civilization, and Africa's place in human history. For centuries, Western scholarship operated under racist assumptions that denied African peoples the capacity for independent cultural achievement. Egypt was acknowledged as a great civilization, but was mentally separated from the rest of Africa, attributed to Mediterranean or Middle Eastern influences rather than African origins. The idea that black African peoples in Nubia might have created the first kingdom in the Nile Valley and given Egypt the template for Pharaonic civilization challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchies and cultural capabilities. The story of Ta-Seti is thus inseparable from the broader story of African history's recovery and the ongoing struggle to decolonize historical narratives. For too long, African history was presented as a story of outside influences, of civilizations imported from elsewhere or imposed by colonizers. Indigenous African achievements were minimized or denied entirely. The message, implicit or explicit, was that Africans were historically passive, incapable of creating complex civilizations without external guidance. This racist narrative served colonial and imperial interests, justifying European domination of the continent and the exploitation of its peoples and resources. It has persisted long after formal colonialism ended, continuing to shape popular perceptions and academic debates. Restoring Ta-Seti to its rightful place in history is an act of historical justice. It acknowledges that African peoples were full participants in the development of human civilization from its earliest moments. It recognizes that kingdoms and complex societies arose independently in Africa, created by Africans who were every bit as capable of political organization, technological innovation, and cultural achievement as peoples anywhere else. It asserts that Africa's story is not a footnote to someone else's history, but a central chapter in the human story, one that begins not with European colonization or even with Pharaonic Egypt, but with kingdoms like Ta-Seti that flourished before the pyramids rose. The erasure of Ta-Seti from historical consciousness was deliberate. the result of centuries of ideological investment in narratives that denied African agency and achievement. The recovery of Ta-Seti is equally deliberate, part of a broader project to restore African history, to tell the full story of the continent's past, and to reclaim legacies that were stolen. This work is not simply academic. It has real-world implications for how people understand themselves, their ancestors, and their place in the human story. For Africans and people of African descent, recovering histories like Ta-Seti provides connection to a past of power and achievement, challenging internalized narratives of inferiority and offering ancestors worthy of pride. The Ta-Seti kingdom's military prowess deserves particular attention, as it established traditions that would echo through Nubian history for millennia. The warriors of Ta-Seti were not merely competent fighters, but masters of a particular form of warfare that gave them a decisive advantage over their enemies. The bow was their weapon of choice, and they wielded it with a skill that became legendary throughout the ancient world. Nubian archers could lose arrows with devastating accuracy at distances that rendered enemy weapons useless. They could fire rapidly, maintaining a storm of projectiles that could break infantry charges and disorder enemy formations. Their powerful composite bows, reinforced with sinew and horn, could penetrate armor that deflected other weapons. This military excellence was not accidental, but the result of cultural priorities and constant practice. Boys in Ta-Seti began training with bows from early childhood, developing the strength, coordination, and eye necessary for effective archery. Hunting provided both practical application and additional training, as Nubian hunters pursued game across the deserts and along the Nile, honing skills that would translate directly to warfare. Military service appears to have been both an obligation and a source of prestige, with successful warriors achieving status and rewards. The kingdom's security and prosperity depended on its ability to defend its territories, control its trade routes, and project power against rivals, making military effectiveness essential to survival. But Ta-Seti's military was not solely defensive. Like kingdoms throughout history, it engaged in offensive operations to expand territory, secure resources, and preempt threats. Raids into neighboring regions brought back captives who could be enslaved or ransomed, livestock that enriched herders, and plunder that filled royal treasuries. Campaigns of conquest extended Ta-Seti's authority over surrounding peoples, bringing them into tributary relationships that provided taxes and labor. The kingdom's military power enabled its commercial success by ensuring that trade routes remained secure and that merchants could travel without fear of bandits or hostile forces. The relationship between Ta-Seti and pre-dynastic Egypt was shaped by this military dynamic. The emerging Egyptian states to the north recognized Nubia's military strength and sought to neutralize it through a combination of trade, diplomacy, and, when necessary, force. Egyptian and Nubian chiefs likely engaged in raids and counter-raids, testing each other's strength and seeking advantage. Some Egyptian leaders may have formed alliances with Ta-Seti, using Nubian warriors as mercenaries in their own conflicts. Others would have seen Nubia as a threat to be contained or a prize to be conquered. This complex relationship of cooperation and competition laid the groundwork for the eventual Egyptian conquest that would end Ta-Seti's independence. The fall of Ta-Seti was not a single cataclysmic event, but a process that unfolded over generations. As Egyptian states consolidated and unified, they gained significant advantages in population, resources, and organizational capacity. The unified Egypt of the early dynastic period could mobilize forces and resources far beyond what Ta-Seti could match. Egyptian rulers conducted systematic campaigns into Nubia, establishing fortifications, suppressing resistance, and gradually extending Pharaonic control southward. Ta-Seti's warriors fought bravely, and rebellions flared repeatedly, but ultimately the kingdom could not withstand the sustained pressure from a much larger and more powerful neighbor. Yet even in defeat, Ta-Seti's legacy endured. The Nubian military traditions that had made the kingdom formidable continued under Egyptian rule. Nubian archers became elite troops in Pharaonic armies, serving in campaigns throughout the Near East and forming specialist units within Egyptian military forces. Their reputation for martial prowess persisted for centuries, with references to Nubian warriors appearing in Egyptian texts, Assyrian records, Greek writings, and Roman sources. When foreigners thought of Nubians, they thought first of their military capabilities, the fearsome archers who had terrified enemies since the days of Ta-Seti. The cultural continuity between Ta-Seti and later Nubian kingdoms is evident in multiple domains. Religious practices, while evolving over time, maintained distinctive Nubian elements that distinguished them from Egyptian traditions, even when the two influenced each other. Artistic styles showed both continuity and development, with Nubian craftsmen maintaining techniques and aesthetic preferences that had deep historical roots. Social structures, while affected by Egyptian domination, preserved elements that reflected indigenous traditions rather than purely imported models. Language, though difficult to reconstruct for Ta-Seti itself, appears to have maintained continuity in Nubia across millennia, with the Meroitic language of later periods possibly representing a development of earlier Nubian speech. This cultural persistence testifies to the strength of Ta-Seti's legacy, a civilization that could be conquered but not eradicated, that could be suppressed but not destroyed, that could be erased from official histories but not from the memories and practices of its people. The kingdom of Ta-Seti planted seeds that would continue to bear fruit for thousands of years, influencing not only its direct successors in Nubia, but also the broader development of Nile Valley civilization. Modern Sudan and southern Egypt, the lands where Ta-Seti once flourished, bear the weight of this history. The peoples of these regions are the descendants of those ancient kingdom builders, inheritors of a legacy that stretches back to the dawn of civilization. Yet many are unaware of this heritage, victims of the same erasure that has hidden Ta-Seti from global consciousness. Educational systems that prioritize Egyptian history while neglecting Nubian civilization, museums that display Nubian artifacts without proper context, and popular media that ignores African achievements all contribute to ongoing historical amnesia. But there are efforts to recover and celebrate this past. Scholars, particularly African and African diaspora researchers, are conducting new investigations, reanalyzing old evidence, and publishing works that restore Nubian history to its proper prominence. Museums in Sudan showcase Nubian civilization, providing opportunities for citizens and visitors to encounter the material culture of their ancestors. Cultural organizations work to preserve Nubian language, traditions, and identity in the face of modernization and displacement. These efforts represent a reclamation of stolen history, an assertion that the peoples of Nubia have a past worthy of pride and a legacy that demands recognition. The construction of the Aswan High Dam, while bringing economic benefits to Egypt, came at tremendous cost to Nubian communities. Thousands of people were displaced from ancestral lands, forced to relocate as their villages disappeared beneath Lake Nasser's waters. The landscape of their ancestors, the places where Ta-Seti had flourished, became submerged ruins, accessible only to divers and underwater archaeologists. This physical erasure mirrored the historical erasure that had preceded it, literally burying Nubian heritage beneath waters that served Egyptian development while ignoring Nubian losses. Yet, Nubian communities have maintained their identity despite displacement and marginalization. They preserve their language, though it is endangered and spoken by diminishing numbers. They maintain cultural practices, music, and traditions that connect them to their past. They assert their distinct identity within the nations of Egypt and Sudan, refusing to be absorbed into dominant Arab cultures. This resistance, this insistence on maintaining heritage despite overwhelming pressure, echoes the resilience that allowed Nubian civilization to survive millennia of foreign rule and cultural pressure. It is the spirit of Ta-Seti, living on in its descendants. The story of Ta-Seti resonates far beyond the Nile Valley. For people of African descent throughout the diaspora, the kingdom represents ancestral achievement, proof that their forebears built civilizations and created cultures of sophistication and power. In a world that has systematically denied and denigrated African accomplishments, Ta-Seti stands as evidence of historical greatness, a foundation for pride, and a challenge to racist narratives. It provides a connection to a past that slavery and colonialism tried to sever, a reminder that the ancestors were kings and queens, warriors and merchants, craftspeople and priests, not merely victims and slaves. This connection matters because history shapes identity. The stories we tell about the past influence how we understand ourselves in the present and what we believe possible in the future. When African history is presented as beginning with slavery or colonization, when African civilizations are ignored or minimized, it creates a distorted worldview that denies agency and achievement to African peoples. Recovering histories like Ta-Seti disrupts these narratives, providing alternative stories that center African power and accomplishment, that demonstrate continuity between ancient greatness and contemporary potential. The kingdom's influence on Egypt itself, though long denied, is becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The royal iconography found at Kustul predates similar imagery in Egypt, suggesting northward cultural diffusion rather than the reverse. The economic relationship between pre-dynastic Egypt and Nubia, with Egyptian sites yielding Nubian trade goods and raw materials, indicates that Ta-Seti was not a peripheral backwater, but a significant power whose resources and connections were essential to Egyptian development. The military impact of Nubian forces, which would later serve Egyptian pharaohs throughout their imperial expansion, demonstrates capabilities that were already developed during Ta-Seti's independent existence. Some scholars now argue that we should understand early Nile Valley civilization as a single cultural complex, with regional variations rather than as Egypt and something else. In this view, Ta-Seti and pre-dynastic Egypt were closely related societies that influenced each other, sharing cultural innovations and developing along parallel paths before Egypt's eventual political domination of the region. This framework better fits the archaeological evidence than older models that portrayed Egypt as unique and Nubia as perpetually subordinate. It recognizes that civilization in the Nile Valley was a collaborative development with contributions from peoples throughout the region, not the exclusive achievement of one group. Ta-Seti's story is ultimately about more than one kingdom in one place at one time. It is about the origins of African civilization, the development of complex societies, the exercise of power, and the creation of legacies. It is about how history is written and who gets to write it, about whose stories are told and whose are erased. It is about the ongoing struggle to recover suppressed histories and to understand the full scope of human achievement. Most fundamentally, it is about recognizing that civilization's roots run deep in African soil, that the peoples of the continent have been creating, innovating, and building for as long as humans have done these things anywhere. Before the pharaohs, there was Ta-Seti. This simple fact, supported by archaeological evidence and increasingly accepted by scholars, rewrites the history of the Nile Valley and challenges assumptions about civilization's origins. It places black African peoples at the very beginning of the story, not as followers or imitators, but as pioneers and creators. It demonstrates that the capacity for complex social organization, political centralization, cultural sophistication, and technological innovation has never been the exclusive property of any one race or region, but is part of our shared human heritage. The land of the Bao stood for centuries as a beacon of African achievement, a kingdom that controlled vital trade routes, developed sophisticated crafts, organized powerful military forces, and created symbols of kingship that would resonate throughout history. Its cities rose from the desert, its merchants traded across vast distances, its warriors defended its borders and projected its power, and its rulers governed with authority that combined earthly power and divine sanction. This was not primitive tribalism or simple chiefdom, but true civilization in all its complexity. When Egypt conquered Ta-Seti, it did not erase what the kingdom had built. The foundations remained, buried beneath layers of subsequent history, but never completely destroyed. They influenced the later Nubian kingdoms that would rise from Ta-Seti's ashes, kingdoms like Kush and Meroe that would rival and sometimes surpass their Egyptian neighbors. They influenced Egyptian civilization itself, providing trade goods, military forces, and possibly even the fundamental symbols and structures of Pharaonic kingship. They influenced the broader development of African civilization, demonstrating patterns of state formation and cultural achievement that would be repeated across the continent. Today, as we work to recover this history, we are not merely engaged in academic research or historical curiosity. We are reclaiming a legacy, restoring ancestors to their rightful place, and challenging narratives that have justified centuries of exploitation and oppression. We are asserting that African history matters, that African achievements deserve recognition, and that the story of human civilization is incomplete without Africa's contributions fully acknowledged. We are providing contemporary Africans and people of African descent with knowledge of their ancestors' greatness, knowledge that can inspire pride, inform identity, and fuel aspirations for the future. The waters of Lake Nasser now cover much of Ta-Seti's physical remains. The cities lie beneath the surface, accessible only to those with specialized equipment and training. Many artifacts were lost before they could be documented, their stories lost forever. But what remains is sufficient to establish the kingdom's reality and importance. The tombs at Kustul speak across millennia. The royal iconography proclaims ancient power. The trade goods testify to far-reaching connections. The weapons demonstrate military sophistication. The pottery shows artistic skill. Ta-Seti was real, Ta-Seti was first, and Ta-Seti matters. The kingdom that stood before the pharaohs reminds us that beginnings matter, that origins shape what follows, and that foundations determine what can be built. Ta-Seti was a beginning, the first kingdom in the Nile Valley, the earliest known complex civilization in this region that would become synonymous with ancient grandeur. Its legacy lives on in every pyramid that rises from Egyptian sands, in every Nubian community that maintains its identity, in every descendant who learns that their ancestors built kingdoms and created civilizations at the very dawn of history. This is the story they did not teach in schools, the history that was deliberately erased, the legacy that was stolen. But it cannot remain hidden forever. The evidence exists. The truth emerges. Ta-Seti takes its place in human history, not as a footnote or curiosity, but as a foundational chapter in the story of civilization. The land of the bow, the first kingdom, the forgotten beginning that made everything else possible. Before Egypt became Egypt, before the pharaohs ruled, before the pyramids rose, there was Ta-Seti. And that matters. That changes everything. That rewrites the story of Africa and the story of human civilization itself. The kingdom may have fallen millennia ago, but its legacy endures, challenging us to see the past more clearly, to understand history more completely, and to recognize that African peoples have been civilization builders from the very beginning of recorded time.